move up. I've got this on 14, and if I made it bigger, it wouldn't have been a bad idea, but this is 20 pages, and I just didn't want to go any longer. But not all are full pages. Some of them are finishing up a thought. Well, I don't need to have anything out for a while, do I?
Oh, that'd be great, thank you.
And then you have somebody bring a stand.
Oh, that would be wonderful. Thank you. Well, they're still coming.
That's a good sign.
Now, this does, Celia will need this out off of it.
I think she said it's on, but they have to turn the, there you go.
Try it again. Obviously not a Jewish crowd. Just have to slow them down for a second. Celia, you'll need this when you do.
Maybe I'll hold the microphone for you.
Yeah, I'll hold it for
Or
you.
you hold it, because you got
Yeah, she does need to. You've got one. Oh, perfect, thank you. I will. Well, Dorian, whatever, you know. All right, all right. Thank you.
You're welcome. So,
Vodka?
yeah.
Jerry, make sure you want this in.
Are we live? Oh, okay. Test, test. Good evening. Going to use the natural pause to begin, and our AV team should have things going for the rest of the world momentarily, if not already. But welcome to St. Francis. We are glad that you are with us this evening. Bob Rothman and Father Alexei will be giving a talk this evening on the roots of anti-Semitism. This is the second part of a discussion they began at Rolling Hills 2 weeks ago. It is unfortunate, to say the least, that discussions like this are still necessary. Bob and I had lunch about a month ago, and he was talking about the roots of anti-Semitism, and I foolishly said, well, it goes back to the Assyrians. And he said, no, the Assyrians hated everybody. It started with Christianity, which was a kick to the gut, because I'd lived in blissful ignorance until that lunch with Bob. But it's important that we learn, and I'm glad that he's willing to take the time to do this, and I'm glad that you're willing to take the time to come here and listen. And so this evening we'll hear from Bob and Father Alexei, and before we begin, Celia is going to light the first candles on the menorah. It is the first night of Hanukkah, which began at sundown, and so it is a very appropriate evening to hear this lecture. And so I'll turn it over to Celia.
Our ancestors in ancient days and in our time. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, shesha atzan nisim lavavatenu ba yamim hahim uvazman hazeh.
Do this for you.
Yes.
Is that on?
No. Yeah. Okay, we're good.
And then there is one additional prayer that we say on the first night of Hanukkah, on the beginnings of all festivals and all happy occasions. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, she'achiyanu v'kiyamanu b'hiyanu lazman hazeh. Praised O you, O Lord our God, sovereign of the universe, who has kept us in life, sustained us, and brought us to this day. Amen. I guess I should say something about Hanukkah. The Hanukkah is a 9-branch candelabra. The 7-branch is described in the Bible and was part of the sacred articles of the temple. The Arch of Titus, who conquered the temple, has a picture of people bearing that 7-branch candelabra in a victory procession in Rome. Hanukkah is the only holiday, biblical holiday of that time that we have, that we know exactly the history of, and it happened in 164 BCE. The Syrian Greeks had controlled Judea, and they had profaned the temple. The Hasmoneans or Maccabees, led by Judah Maccabee, had defeated them, reclaimed the temple, and it was time to rededicate the temple. So they looked up Solomon's procedure for dedicating the original temple and somewhat followed that in their dedication. Hanukkah means dedication, and it is 8 days because that was the time that Solomon took to dedicate his temple. There are uglier aspects of that time period because the Greeks were trying to convert the Jews into Greek culture and traditions, and there were those who went along and there were those who opposed them. So not only was there a war against the Syrian Greeks, there were elements of a civil war that were involved, but the Maccabees won and rededicated the temple. We celebrate that every year around this time of the year. It moves around because the Jewish calendar has lunar months and then makes up for it by adding time to keep the calendar consistent. There is nothing in the tradition of Hanukkah that relates to gift giving, absolutely nothing, but Jewish kids needed something in December, and that's when that tradition began, so that they could show their Christian classmates what they got for Hanukkah. But there is nothing in the traditional and rabbinic sources about gift giving. So let's go on, get started here. Father Alexei.
Thank you, Bob. We Christians are happy to share the gift-giving crises with you, Jews. And thank you, Father, for welcoming us this evening. Those of you who were with us last week recall that I began with a prayer. I read the prayer that the late Pope John Paul II, blessed memory, composed and then inserted in the Kotel, the Western Wall in Jerusalem, when he made his historic pilgrimage there. And that prayer said in part, "We are deeply saddened by the behavior of those who in the course of history have caused these children of yours," meaning the Jews, "to suffer. And asking your forgiveness, we wish to commit ourselves to genuine brotherhood with the people of the covenant." And then we went on, and I walked us through some of the teachings of the early church fathers when we were not acting as genuine brothers and sisters with the people of the covenant. We looked at some of the teachings of Catholic Church authorities, civil authorities in those days. And I ended ultimately with Pope John the 23rd's famous basta, meaning enough, when he, as Pope, was presiding at his first Good Friday service as Pope, and they brought him the book of the prayers for the service. And in those days, our service father continued to have a prayer for the conversion of the Jews. And John the 23rd said, enough of that. We're not praying for the conversion of the Jews any longer. So what I'd like to do then tonight is to take us from there to where we are today, and more particularly, how we interact as Catholics with the Jewish community here in Los Angeles. In 1986, in April, Pope John Paul II made an historic visit to the synagogue in Rome. It was the first time that a Catholic Pope had entered the synagogue since the apostles left what is today the Holy Land and slightly beyond. Not until 1986. And there, I had the privilege once of being in that famous synagogue, and you could still feel his presence, still resonating from the walls. And I'd like to share a bit of what he said there that day. Today's visit is meant to make a decisive contribution to the consolidation of the good relations between our two communities, an imitation of the example of so many men and women who have worked and who are still working today on both sides to cover over old prejudices and to secure ever wider and fuller recognition of that bond and that common spiritual patrimony that exists between Jews and Christians. This is the hope expressed in the fourth paragraph of a document entitled Nostra Aetate from the Second Vatican Council on the relationship between the Church to non-Christian religions. The decisive turning point in relations, the Pope said, between the Catholic Church and Judaism and individual Jews was occasioned by this brief but incisive paragraph. We are all aware that among the riches of this paragraph in section 4 of the document, 3 points are especially relevant. I would like to underline them here before you in this truly unique circumstance. The first, and we hinted at this last time, the first is that the Church of Christ discovers that her bond with Judaism discovers that bond by searching into her own mystery. The Jewish religion is not extrinsic to us, but in a certain way is intrinsic to our own religion. With Judaism, therefore, we have a relationship which we do not have with other religions. You, the Jews, are our deeply beloved brothers and sisters, and in a certain way it could be said that you are our elder brothers and sisters. The second point noted by the Council, Second Vatican Council, is that no ancestral or collective blame can be imputed to the Jews as a people for what happened in Christ's Passion. Not indiscriminately to Jews of that time, not to those who came afterwards, nor to those of today. So any alleged theological justification for discriminatory measures, or worse still, for acts of persecution is unfounded. The Lord will judge each one according to his or her works, Jews and Christians alike. And the third point that I would like to make, the Pope said, is to emphasize in the Council's declaration that it is a sequence of the second. Notwithstanding the Church's awareness of her own identity, it is not lawful to say that the Jews are repudiated or cursed as if this were taught or could be deduced from the sacred scriptures of the Old or New Testaments. Indeed, the Council had already said this in its text Nostra Aetate, and also in Lumen Gentium, referring to St. Paul's letter to the Romans, that the Jews are beloved of God, who has called them with an irrevocable calling. That document, to which John Paul II is referring, Nostra Aetate, of the Second Vatican Council's 16 major documents, more than 100,000 words, by far the shortest is Nostra Aetate, the declaration on the relationship of the Church to non-Christian religions, also known in English as In Our Time, promulgated by Pope Paul VI on the 28th of October, 1965. Only 41 sentences in 5 paragraphs. The fourth paragraph, on the Jews in particular, is the longest, and that's 17 sentences. But those 17 sentences totally revolutionized Catholic teaching towards our Jewish brothers and sisters. Without it, I wouldn't be here today, and we wouldn't be enjoying the relationship that, for the most part, we have. Not always, but for the most part, we have. So Nostra Aetate stands as a revolutionary document in itself, but it also initiated Catholic the whole interfaith movement. To be brutally honest with you, we weren't interested before Nostra Aetate, and now we're an integral part of all of this. Nostra Aetate has an interesting history. When John the 23rd, the Pope at the time who summoned the Second Vatican Council, before he became Pope, He had a very varied career, if you will, in the church. He was, prior to becoming Pope, he was the Archbishop of Venice in Italy. Before that, he was in the Papal Diplomatic Corps and served as Papal Nuncio or ambassador not only to France, but also to Turkey. And he was in Turkey in that assignment during the Second World War. And as nuncio there, he facilitated, helped facilitate, the migration of many Jews fleeing the Holocaust in Eastern Europe through Turkey to what was then known as the British Mandate of Palestine. Years ago, I twice had the opportunity of being in the old nunciature in Istanbul before the capital was moved to Ankara. Unfortunately, they don't allow people to enter that anymore, but they used to with special connections. So I had the privilege of sitting in his chair. I had the privilege of walking on the same carpet that he walked on. I had the privilege of praying in the chapel and where he prayed. And in that tiny chapel, someone subsequently has installed a huge portrait of him. And the eyes are the eyes of, you've all seen these portraits where the eyes follow you wherever you go, very penetratingly peering into you, almost asking you, what are you doing to continue the movement that I started? What are you doing to continue that? For he always had this question in his mind, what he termed the Jewish question. And when he became Pope and summoned the Second Vatican Council, the Jewish question still percolated in the back of his mind. And then in 1960, an elderly Jewish man named Jules Isaac from France, who had started a kind of a rapprochement between Jews, some Jews and some Catholics there in France, he went and he spoke with Pope John the 23rd and begged him, saying that the teachings of contempt of the Jews by the Catholic Church are unbiblical, and you must do something to change this. And so this resonated with John the 23rd's Jewish question as to what was the culpability of Catholic churches leading up to the Holocaust. And he instructed one of the cardinals prefects to write this document. The document was to be initially only about the Jews, but Nostra Aetate then was expanded in the discussions of the council to include Muslims, Hindus, and Buddhists as well, and by extension, every and all non-Christian faiths. And thanks be to God, this document then was passed by a vote of the Council of Bishops, 2,221 yeses and only 88 noes, which shows us that the Holy Spirit here was guiding us to make this right decision to work on our relationship with the Jewish people. So how do we enflesh that here in Los Angeles? Well, we do this in a number of ways, or I should say we try to do this in a number of ways. I've been the ecumenical and interreligious officer for the Archdiocese now. I begin, this month is my 20th year doing this. And I've seen some successes, and I've seen some failures, and I've certainly seen areas where we need to improve. For example, we have a priest-rabbi dialogue, where a number of priests, a number of rabbis meet once a month. We've looked at a number of different topics, trying to gain knowledge of the other. How does the other approach this? Life cycle events, for example. Sabbath. What does the Sabbath mean to a Catholic? What does the Sabbath mean to a Jew? What can we learn from each other? I'm not speaking for the rabbis here, but I'm speaking for the priests that belong there. I thought initially we would have a magazine type of article with questions and answers at the back, that we could use as a tool for partnering Jewish congregations and a Catholic congregation to learn together. The priests, however, got very verbose, and with all due respect to the rabbis also, they got very verbose. And those little magazine-style articles that I envisioned now a book of 1,000 pages. Well, nobody's going to read a book of 1,000 pages. Yeah, not going to happen. I went to every Catholic publisher I could find, asking them whether they would publish this. Oh no, Father, nobody's going to read that. And finally, they suggested, why don't you redo some of this on YouTube videos? So that's what we've done now. And you can find these YouTube videos online easily. There's not only one, but there are two sections now, two different groups of Catholic and Jewish women who come together for a conference each year, one located here in the South Bay. The other one is located in West LA, San Fernando Valley. And these ladies have been, the one in the LA and San Fernando Valley, they've been at it for something like 30-some years. And the beauty here is that not only do they discuss things at their monthly meetings and then hold a huge conference every year about this, open to the public, but they've grown in friendship and support for one another. Most recently, one of the Jewish ladies was having some rather difficult surgery, and she asked for prayers from her Catholic sisters on that group. That shows a certain solidarity and acceptance and support of the other. We partner with the Anti-Defamation League in a program called Bearing Fruit, whereby Rabbi Elliot Dorff, and myself present in not all, certainly we have 50 high schools in the Archdiocese. In certain high schools or certain groupings of faculty of high schools, we immersed the faculty and the staff in an all-day seminar combating anti-Semitism, what to look for, how to look at the roots, acknowledge where we're responsible, what we need to do to amend those things. It's quite a good program, and I wish more of our schools would take advantage of it. With the American Jewish Committee, the American Jewish Committee here used to fund a rabbi who would come to some of those 50 high schools and present Judaism 101 to the students in our Catholic school. When I first took this position, I was fascinated by this. And I went with him and just sat in on the class to see, what is he teaching these kids? He had them mesmerized. He would bring, this is probably not, we're recording this, so I'm not going to mention his name because I don't want to get him in trouble. But he would bring the Torah scroll, and he would roll out the Torah scroll, and these kids would have an opportunity to come up and look at it. And then when they couldn't read it because it was all in Hebrew, he would read it for them, and he would teach them how to read portions of it. Now, they would ask some rather naive questions. You mean you Jews don't have Christmas? And they would say, no, but we have Hanukkah, that type of thing. So, but it was a learning process. And it was the first time any of them, well, I shouldn't say any, for most of them, first time they'd ever seen a Jew in the flesh. And they were able to interact with them. And it was a wonderful experience. Unfortunately, the AJC had to defund that program. But should it ever be refunded and we reestablish it, I'm going to insist on reciprocity. If we can allow a Jewish rabbi to come and teach Judaism 101 in our schools, we should be allowed then to come in their schools and present Catholicism 101, especially since the Second Vatican Council. I understand that they are reluctant to have us do that because they think we're there to convert them. But since the Second Vatican Council, the Catholic Church acknowledges that the Jews have a covenant with God. They have a covenant of God. Paul in his epistle talks about how Christianity is grafted onto that covenant. And therefore, the Jews are not targeted as a nation for conversion to Christianity by the Catholic Church. We send missionaries everywhere around the world. We don't send any missionaries to Israel. We acknowledge that Jews have a covenant with God, and God has not abrogated that covenant. We have, I remember once being invited to speak at Milken High School in the Florida Pass there, and everyone was very polite and correct, and I gave my little presentation, and then I asked if there were any questions, and some very polite questions, And then finally, one young guy had the guts, if you will, to get up and said, "Now, Father, do I have to be Catholic to enter paradise?" Not every Jew believes in the second life, but this particular man did. And so I looked at him and I said, well, actually, I, as a Catholic, look forward to spending and entering paradise with you as a Jew. And there was dead silence. They'd never heard that before. And one of the teachers said, "Father, I don't think you realize what you just said." And I said, "No, I don't think you realized what I just said. We respect the fact that you have a covenant with God. We're not out to change that covenant with God that you have." We've worked with the AJC also on a number of other issues, most especially immigration issues, things such as that. Passion plays and such, during the Christian Lent, when we're preparing for Easter, especially during Holy Week, some of our parishes have a devotion called Stations of the Cross, where they reenact Christ's passion and death. We have to be very careful there, because we don't want to give any type of stereotypical images or let these depictions of the Passion come out as anti-Semitic. So we have guidelines written by the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. God's Mercy Endures Forever, Guidelines of the Presentation of Jews and Judaism in Catholic Preaching. This came in very handy for me some years ago when, you might recall, Mel Gibson had a movie called The Passion of the Christ. And before it was released, a number of people from the Jewish community came to me, leaders in the Jewish community, said that they were absolutely fearful of this movie, and they wanted me, as if I had the authority to do this, they wanted me to stop its release. I said, I have no authority to stop the release of the film. And I said, why are you afraid? And they were afraid because it would depict the Jews in a very anti-Semitic way, and that it would release a whole new wave of anti-Semitism. So I said, well, let's do this. Let's use this as a teaching moment. And we agreed that they would provide a Jewish film critic and a couple of rabbis. I would provide a Catholic film critic and a couple of priests. I would arrange for a private showing of the film then, or at least a version of the film. There were a couple of different versions of the film. And whatever each film critic wrote about the film, we would publish side by side in our Catholic news publication here, at that time called The Tidings, now called The Angelus. So we did this. We watched the film together, they wrote their reviews, and we published them. And it was a remarkable experience of learning from one another and using each other in a very positive, not using, but working together in a very positive way for the betterment of our communities here. Some years ago also, the Skirball Cultural Institute contacted me about a exhibit about John Paul II, Pope John Paul II, that and his relationship with the Jewish people that they wanted to bring here. And I was aware of this exhibit. I was asked by the exhibit itself to bring it here, but I would have to raise $1 million to do so. And I said, no, I'm not the fundraiser for that. But the Skirball had $1 million. So they were willing to bring it here if I would promote it, which I did amongst the Catholic community. I used to give tours for this. I trained their docents on Catholic terminology and such, so they would be able to understand what they were presenting. I became an honorary docent at the Skirball. I still have a lifetime membership at the Skirball. It's just like this, it's activities like this that have to help to break down barriers between us. We also have a program with the Jewish Federation. At one time, it was only for Catholic secondary school teachers. Now it's thankfully, it's open to everyone, called the Holy Land Democracy Project. I've always been a bit critical of this for this reason. When it was just for Catholic secondary school teachers, they would take some of our teachers over there to Israel. They would immerse them in Israeli life, pardon me, and then expect them to present Israeli life in the classrooms here. But if they would never permit, they wouldn't necessarily permit, they wouldn't facilitate the interaction of our Catholic teachers when they were there in Israel to have any connection with the indigenous Catholic population there. And that, I think, it was a mistake. Life in Israel is not only for Jews. There are Muslims there. There are Christians there. And those Christians happen to be Palestinian. And to give an accurate description of life there, I think there has to be interaction amongst all three entities there. So that would be my criticism of that particular program. We have, I think, that probably the greatest honor that was ever bestowed upon me in this field, at least so far, has been that I've been asked to give eulogies at the funerals of 3 rabbis. That would not have happened before Nostra Aetate. That would not have happened had we not developed these type of relationships here in Los Angeles. And I think that that's where we need to continue. We need to continue to break down barriers. We have to be able to listen to one another and hear what one another is saying, the grief that they've experienced. We may not agree with everything the other is saying, but we have to be able to listen to it. We have to hear where they're coming from, as they have to hear where we're coming from. And we cannot permit these differences between us to inhibit our working together for the betterment of life here in Los Angeles. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
This man is a blessing for all of us. Tonight I will address the U.S. and Israel. Anti-Semitism in the U.S. has been one of eliminating Jews from daily business, professional, and social life, and rarely has it been lethal. In 1654, 23 Jews arrived in New Amsterdam after escaping from Dutch Brazil when it was taken over by Portugal and the Inquisition. Governor Peter Stuyvesant refused admission, saying Jews were a deceitful race that would infect the colony if he did not stop them. He barred them from buying land for important reasons and refused to allow them to take turns standing guard with the citizen militia, citing the aversion and disaffection of this minority to be members of the aforesaid Jewish nation. If they don't like it, consent is hereby given for them to depart whenever and wherever it may please them. Well, the Jewish population they got word to the Jews in Amsterdam, Holland, and there were Dutch laws allowing freedom of religion. These laws were transcribed back to Peter Stuyvesant under the direction that he should stop immediately, which he was forced to do. The Dutch law said each person shall remain free in his religion and ordered the Jews to be allowed to live there. After the American Revolution, most of the colonies changed their constitutions to take all citizens to be equal while ignoring the evils of slavery. Keep in mind, a number of the colonies had been found in the name of religious freedom. In Virginia, only professing Protestants could hold public office, and all residents were required to contribute to the upkeep of the church. Madison and Jefferson led the fight to liberalize the Virginia Constitution against the stand taken by Patrick Henry, and finally won when the Religious Freedom Act passed in 1785. The North Carolina Constitution enfranchised only Protestants, yet a Catholic was elected governor in 1781. In 1808, an attempt was made to remove a Jew who had been elected to the General Assembly, but it failed. The law was ultimately left on the books until it was repealed in 1868. Maryland was the last colony to remove restrictions in 1828, having required anyone serving in public office to be of the Catholic faith. At the time of the Revolution, there were about 2,500 Jews living in the colonies, primarily in the port cities, because they were involved in trade. The Touro Synagogue was built in 1763 in Newport, Rhode Island, and is still standing. George Washington wrote a letter on August the 21st, 1790, to the congregation. And I'm going to read the whole letter. I think it's very important. To the Hebrew congregation in Newport, Rhode Island. Gentlemen, while I receive with much satisfaction your address, replete with the expressions of affection and esteem, I rejoice in the opportunity of assuring you that I shall always remain grateful remembrance of the cordial welcome I received in my visit to you from all classes of citizens. The reflection on the days of difficulty and danger which are past is rendered the more sweet from a consciousness, that they are succeeded by days of uncommon prosperity and security. If we have wisdom to make the best use of the advantages with which we are endowed, we cannot fail under the just administration of a government to become a great people. The citizens of the United States of America have a right to applaud themselves for having given to mankind examples of an enlarged and liberal policy worthy of imitation. All possess like liberty of conscience and immunity of citizenship. It is now no longer that toleration is spoken of as if it was by the indulgence of one class of people that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent nature. For happily, the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens, in giving it all occasions their effort and support. This letter is read every year on the anniversary by the congregation of Touro Synagogue in Newport. And I wish it were read everywhere throughout the country as well. This is the kind of thing where I deeply believe that George Washington is the greatest American ever. And if anybody disagrees with me, I'll be glad to arm wrestle him over the subject. I'm going to read you U.S. Grant, General Order Number 11. Headquarters, 13th Army Corps, Department of the Tennessee, Oxford, Mississippi, December 17, 1862. 1. The Jews as a class violating every regulation of trade established by the Treasury Department and also department orders are hereby expelled from the department, which was Kentucky, Tennessee, and Mississippi. 2. Within 24 hours from receipt of this order by post commanders, they will see that all of this class of people be furnished passes and required to leave, and anyone returning after such notification will be arrested and held in confinement until opportunity occurs of sending him out as prisoners, unless furnished with permission from headquarters. 3, no permit will be given to these people to visit headquarters for the purpose of making personal application for trade permits by order of Major General U.S. Grant, JNO A. Rawlings. It was countermanded by Abraham Lincoln about 2 weeks later on January the 4th, 1863, and there's some really nice satire here. I love Abe here. And the following was issued by the White House. A paper purporting to be General Orders Number 11, issued by you December 17th, has been presented here. By its terms, it expels all Jews from your department. If such an order has been issued, it will be immediately revoked. General Grant showed no other sign of anti-Semitism through the remainder of the war, and during his presidency, he required all of his cabinet to attend the opening of a synagogue in Washington. So one has to think this is just a badly worded thing, but it is part of history. The reason for it is that he was trying to prevent cotton trade because the Confederacy issued bonds to raise money backed by cotton. So they needed the cotton, they needed the Mississippi River, they needed to get it out that way to get it to Europe so they could get money for their treasury. In 1913, in Marietta, Georgia, a young white girl, Mary Fagan, was strangled and her body found in the basement of the pencil factory where she worked. Leo Frank, the 31-year-old Jewish manager of the pencil factory, was accused of the murder with no substantial evidence whatsoever, simply blame the Jew. Jim Conley accused Frank, which many thought be to keep himself from the blame and keep him in the clear. Frank was convicted and sentenced to death. The Georgia governor, John Slayton, was aware of the lack of proof and courageously communicated his death sentence to life imprisonment to buy time. The case attracted attention, and many reporters deemed the conviction a travesty. Within Georgia, this outside criticism fueled anti-Semitism and hatred toward Frank. On August 16, 1915, he was kidnapped from prison by a group of armed men and taken to Marietta, Mary Fagan's hometown the next day, where he was lynched. The new governor vowed to punish the lynchers, who included prominent Marietta citizens, but nobody was charged. In 1986, Frank was posthumously pardoned by the official of the state of the crime. My family lived 40 miles away from Marietta, and 30 years later, and believe me, it was on their minds. I heard it often as a child. And during that time also, the temple in Atlanta was bombed in a very famous incident that was part of Driving Miss Daisy. I grew up in a town of 25,000, Rome, Georgia, with 25 Jewish families. Somehow everybody knew who the Jews were. They knew it of me as a kid. The kids knew it, the adults, they all knew it. I don't know. I was called a Christ killer before I knew what it meant. One advantage in living in such an environment is I learned to separate the good people from the bad. And this has stayed with me, and I appreciate the good people. I'll give you an example of a story. Back in the 1980s, early 80s, I think, I was on a flight from Washington to LA. Guy next to me was sitting reading a book. I had no idea what the language was. The characters, the alphabet was English. I didn't know what it was. So when they served food, back then they served food. When they served food, we got to talking, and he told me he was from Budapest, and that was Hungarian that he was reading. And he looked at me and he said, "You're Jewish, aren't you?" "How did you know that?" And he said, "In Budapest, we have to know these things." And I would hate to think that somebody in the United States could ever make a statement like that. Between 1903 and 1905, more than 3,000 anti-Semitic publications were issued in Russia. One of these was the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, supposedly containing the minutes of a secret meeting of Jews plotting to take over the world. Its authorship is attributed to the Russian secret police and received widespread readership even though it was exposed as a hoax. In 1920, Henry Ford read the book and, believing it to be true, serialized its contents in his newspaper articles supporting its claim, including the scope of Jewish dictatorship in the United States, Jewish degradation of American baseball, and the international Jew, the world's foremost problem. In 1922, he published his article in a book that sold over 1 million copies. My grandfather, my father, and their generations would never buy a Ford. Father Charles Conklin was an outspoken anti-Semite in Detroit and had a connection with Henry Ford. Conklin's 1930s radio show reached over 3 million homes, and his newspaper, with 1 million circulation, published the Protocols of the Elders of Zion and continued to claim the story was real and ongoing. President Woodrow Wilson and former President William Howard Taft, with 119 prominent Americans in January 1921, stated, quoting, "We believe it should not be left to men and women of the Jewish faith to fight this evil, but that it is of very special sense the duty of citizens who are not Jews of ancestry or faith." As I said before, the good people are very important. Bless them. The mood of this country was, however, was expressed by President Calvin Coolidge, old silent Cal, in 1927 during a debate over reduced immigration quotas, and I quote President Coolidge, "Restricted immigration is not an offense, but purely a defensive action. We must remember that every object of our institutions of society and government will fail unless Americans be kept American." During the 1930s and 40s, right-wing demagogues linked the Jews and the Roosevelt administration to the threat of war in Europe. They blamed an international Jewish conspiracy was trying to destroy American democracy. It is that way today. The right blames Jews for being anti-democracy, socialist, and communist, while the left blamed Jews for trying to advance their power and wealth at the expense of Americans. Let that sink in, friends. You can't do both. They're opposites. It's impossible to do both. This shows the intelligence of the anti-Semite. In a speech delivered September 11th, 1941 at an American First rally, Charles Lindbergh claimed that three groups had been pressing this country toward war: the Roosevelt administration, the British, and the Jews, and complained about what he insisted was the Jews' large ownership and influence in our motion picture, our press, our radio, and our government. We still hear that charge today. Let me lighten up a minute here. Jews are excellent at black humor. It comes with their history. But there's a story of two old Jewish men sitting on a park bench in the summer, and each one is reading a newspaper. One is reading the Daily Forward, which is the New York Jewish newspaper. The other was reading The Nation of Islam, published by Farrakhan. So the guy reading the Jewish Forward says to the other one, "Harry, why don't you read a good Jewish paper? Why are you reading that anti-Semitic crap?" And he says, "Josh, listen, when I read a Jewish newspaper, I get depressed. I learn about anti-Semitism, I read about intermarriage, I read about troubles with Israel, I read about political problems. When I read The Nation of Islam, I learn the Jews own the banks, the Jews own the networks, and the Jews own the media, and I feel good." Mr. Dubois wrote report to the Secretary of the acquiescence of the government in the murder of the Jews. The document was an indictment of U.S. diplomatic, military, and immigration policies. Among other things, the report narrated the State Department's inaction and some instances active opposition to the release of funds for the Jews in Europe. And it condemned immigration policy that closed American doors to Jewish refugees from the countries engaged in their systematic destruction. On January 16, 1944, Henry Morgenthau and Randolph Paul personally delivered the Dubois report to Franklin Roosevelt, warning him that Congress would act if he did not. The result was Executive Order 9417, creating the Refugee Board composed of the Secretaries of State, Treasury, and War, issued on January 22nd, 1944. It declared that it is the policy of the government to take all measures within its power to rescue the victims of enemy oppression who are in imminent danger of death, and otherwise to afford such victims all possible relief and assistance, consistent with the successful prosecution of the war. Not specific, very general, but better than nothing. After the German surrender, I'm going to read two quotes to you about the condition in the concentration death camps after the German surrender. First, Earl G. Harrison was sent by Harry Truman to report on conditions of the Jews in August 1945, 3 months after the German surrender. Quoting, "We appear to be treating the Jews as the Nazis treated them, except that we do not exterminate them. They are in concentration camps in large numbers under our military guard instead of SS troops. 3 months after VE Day and even longer after the liberation of the individual camps, many Jews, displaced persons, and others are living under guard behind barbed wire fence amidst crowded, often unsanitary, and generally grim conditions, in complete idleness, waiting, hoping for some word of encouragement and action on their behalf. Now I'm going to read you an entry from the diary of General George S. Patton, who was in charge of Bavaria, military governor of Bavaria. And this is a quote, Chile. On September 15th, 1945, his diary entry, quoting, Harrison and his ilk believe the DP, displaced person, is a human being, which he is not. And this applies particularly to the Jews who were lower than animals. Our great hero, General Patton of Pasadena. Throughout this country, there are what was euphemistically called real estate covenants, CC&R, covenants, conventions, and restrictions that were written into sales contracts at a time when development of open spaces was widespread. Some specified industrial exclusion and prevented billboards, which are reasonable objectives. Racist ones use various words to restrict neighborhood land and home sales to Caucasians, the term they use to exclude blacks, Asians, and Hispanics, and extended in ignorance to include Jews, who were as much Caucasian as anybody else. They existed in the LA area along Sunset Boulevard and Wilshire and in Palos Verdes Estates. It wasn't until 1948 when restrictions because of race, were declared unconstitutional, yet it took 20 more years until the Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968 for the reality of the civil rights protection to take hold. I'll give you a few examples. In Palos Verdes Estates, covenant forbade owners to sell, rent, owners forbidden to sell or rent house to anyone not of the white or Caucasian race, or to permit blacks on their property, with the exception of chauffeurs, gardeners, and domestic servants. Forest Hills Garden, Queens, New York. Covenants forbade the sale of real properties to blacks, Jews, and working class people. Jackson Heights, Queens, New York. Covenants employed to restrict occupancy to white non-immigrant Protestants. Upper Arlington, Ohio. Covenants forbade the sale of real property to blacks or Jews, but did allow for colored servants to reside in the residence. Williamstown, Massachusetts, in 1939, prohibited any non-white, not in domestic service, from living in the town. Kansas City, both at the Johnson County in the suburbs and at the country club area of downtown Riverside, Kansas City, restricted covenants used to exclude blacks and Semitic people. I strongly recommend you watch the film Gentleman's Agreement to see what sophisticated American anti-Semitism in 1947 was like. It was awarded the Oscar for Best Picture, and the film was selected for preservation in United States libraries by the Library of Congress as being culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. It stars Gregory Peck as a Christian named Green, who, writing story of anti-Semitism in employment, housing, medicine, and hotels in New York and Connecticut suburbs. To do so, he claimed to be a Jew named Greenberg and watched the reaction compared with his Christian experience as Green under the same circumstances. Hollywood made its case very strongly, as it usually does, when demons demonstrating problem in society, and this particular societal problem was personal to the Jews who had created the Hollywood film industry. For one specific example, which I heard about when I was a kid, the Kenilworth Hotel in Miami Beach had a sign on its front lawn, "No dogs or Jews." Many universities and professional societies had Jewish quotas. I know a friend who was refused admission to a highly respected university because they told him they'd exceeded their Jewish quota as late as 1970. Private clubs, civic organizations, banks, law and accounting firms, and hospital medical staff excluded Jews. This is why there are Jewish law firms, Jewish hospitals, and Jewish social clubs, as Jews were forced to start their own. Both City of Hope and Cedars-Sinai were begun by Jewish physicians excluded from Christian hospitals. In New Orleans, the Jews are excluded from the crews which make up the floats for the Mardi Gras parade because of their Jewishness. So what the Jews have done in New Orleans is support the hospital. I'm going to read you a couple of polls to show you how things have get depressed and how they have somewhat changed in ways. The first was taken weeks after Pearl Harbor, asked Americans to name the U.S.'s greatest enemies. So this would be January 1942. Japan, 25%. Germany, 18%. Jews, 15%. A later poll in June 1944 asking the greatest threat, Jews, this is 1944, the war is still going on. Jews, 24%, Japanese, 9%, Germans, 6%. In a different poll in 1945, 58% Jews have too much power. I've not seen a recent poll because nobody's going to use that kind of language to make a poll anymore. You can't ask a question as direct as that. But I will give you some recent polling. April 1915, a poll published as the 2014 audit of anti-Semitic incidents in the United States. It counted 912 during 2014, a 21% increase from 2013. There were 3,710 in 2022, a 37% increase from 2,717 of 2021, and fourfold increase from 2014, 8 years earlier. This trend is downright scary. Anti-Semitism has always been the canary in the coal mine. It's a leading indicator of decline of tolerance and respect for people of all cultures. Our country is growing intolerant and disrespectful of others, and only bad things can result from that kind of behavior. The principal focus of the anti-Semite today is the conflict in the Middle East. The history is complex, and everyone selects the facts that they want to believe. I support Israel because it is the only refuge for all Jews to live productive lives in safety as Jews without immigration restrictions. The survivors of the Holocaust could not return to their pre-war countries and were not welcomed in many places in enough numbers, so they went to Israel. 2 million Russian Jews, many of them went to Israel. 164,400 Ethiopian Jews now live in Israel and were moved there from Operation Moses and other airlifts to bring them to safety. In 1900, Jews were 40% of Baghdad's population. And in 1948, before the creation of Israel, more than 850,000 Jews who had lived in Muslim countries in North Africa and the Middle East, many for over 2,000 years. Today, the total number of that 850,000 Jews living in North Africa and the Middle East is less than 2,000. As they were forced to leave their homes with whatever they could carry, their property was confiscated. Most had no place to go. 650,000 of the 850,000 settled in Israel. Please understand why Jewish people defend Israel. They do not wish harm to Palestinians, but place critical importance on Israel as the only guaranteed refuge of displaced Jews from throughout the world. I support Israel for that reason. There are many policies of the Israeli government I strongly disagree with. There are many policies of the American government I strongly disagree with. There are many policies of other democracies I strongly disagree with. Now, for the first time since the Maccabee victory that we celebrate as Hanukkah today, Jews are able to defend themselves as history has shown they must bear that burden alone. Never again has been the watchword since the Holocaust. How many countries in the Middle East are democracies? One. How many countries in the Middle East allow LGBT people to live free and productive lives? One. How many countries in the Middle East encourage the practice of all religions? One. How many countries in the world have their right to exist disputed? One. And of course, that one is Israel. The constant criticism Israel receives has to be anti-Semitism. Russia stole Crimea and invaded a peaceful Ukraine, attacking its civilian population ruthlessly and stealing its children, yet there are no protests in the streets. China puts their Uyghurs in concentration camps and stamps out democracy. Myanmar, Sudan, Yemen, and Ethiopia are engaged in ethnic cleansing, yet there are no protests in the streets for them, about them. If there were protests against these other countries, I would say it is principled and not anti-Semitism. But when it is only Israel, a true democracy, I say it's anti-Semitism. One more addition to a long history of the world's oldest hatred. The history of anti-Semitism is a wound that all Jews bear, and fear it can happen again is real. Let me ask a question of the Christians present. How much of your annual church budget goes to security? What? When I ask Christian clergy that question, they say, what? Well, every synagogue has a security budget. It goes right along with housing, salaries, utilities, security. They feel they have to protect themselves. In this United States, that's what they feel. Mm. They're telling me to stop, huh? There. Yeah, thank you. Huh. We begin Hanukkah, the festival of lights, earlier by lighting the candles. American Jews have always placed lit candles in a window, but many are afraid to do so today. Friends who always placed Hanukkah decorations using Hanukkah Harry as a counter to Santa Claus on their front lawns this time of year as a good-natured expression are afraid to do it today. They don't want to advertise their Jewishness. Some fear to show their Jewishness with skull caps in public or with jewelry. Fear from being a Jew has no place in this country, as George Washington promised. I want you to understand anti-Semitism, the world's longest hatred, is directed against Jews solely because we are Jews. Think about the actions of the anti-Semite. Condemn people they have never met, people they have no idea of what they say or think, people they have no knowledge of whether they are good or bad, only that they are Jews. Whenever a physical or verbal attack is made against any Jew, I know it could be me, and all Jews know it could be them. I missed a page somewhere. I was going to, and I don't have the notes. Tuesday, the presidents of Harvard, MIT, and Penn were called to testify before the House Committee about the safety of anti-Semitism on their campus. One of the representatives asked the three of them a very direct question. Is advocation of sorry, I'll get it in a minute. I don't have that page. Is advocating ethnic cleansing of Jews against your code of ethics? Not a one of them said yes. They equivocated. They talked about context. They didn't say, no, you can't do that on my campus. And then, in showing complete ignorance, the president of Harvard said that anti-Semitism is cured is a result of ignorance, and it's cured by knowledge. Well, friends, that is an example of saying, in the greatest truth of George Santayana's statement that those who don't understand history are doomed to repeat it. The most advanced educational country in the world was Nazi Germany, and they gave us the Holocaust. To me, these three presidents typify an old Brit saying that I just happen to like a lot. They're too clever by half. Can you understand why Jewish people feel isolated? I'm going to read you a quote from Senator Chuck Schumer, and I'm going to close with this. Can you understand Jewish people feel isolated when we hear some praise of Hamas and chant its vicious slogan? Can you blame us for feeling vulnerable only 80 years after Hitler wiped out half the Jewish population while many countries turned their backs? Can you appreciate the deep fear we have about what Hamas might do if left to their own devices? Because the long arc of Jewish history teaches us a lesson, it's hard to forget, ultimately, that we are alone. Thank you for listening. Thank you for coming. Now, you want to take the mic and see what people want to find out.
First, I want to thank Bob, who is the head of Dawn Unity, for preparing this program, and Father Alexei. Thank you very much. Are there any? If you have a question for either Bob or Father Alexei, I encourage you to stand up and ask your question. Unfortunately, we don't have a mic to pass around to people in the congregation, but I have good ears. And so if they don't hear you, I will relay your question to them. Yes, sir.
Reinhard, it's a very, well, we've discussed this before, it's a very difficult situation. Somebody comes in and murders 1,400 of your citizens, murders, beheads, tortures, kills a family, and then sits down to eat their food. Pure evil and sickness. So what is the correct response? When both Hamas and Israel prepare their hospitals. Hamas puts their weapons and their coordinating facilities underneath hospitals, knowing that Israelis will not attack the hospital, will not bomb the hospitals. Israel puts their operating theaters and their critical health care underground because they know Hamas will attack their hospitals. So you're talking about people who have very different concepts of evil and right and wrong. Yes, we all feel great sympathy for the innocent people of Gaza. Absolutely. It's terrible what's happened to them. But I don't know what the alternative is. You can't leave Hamas alone either. They've shown what they can do. It's a very difficult problem. It's not an idealistic kind of answer. Yes, Israelis try not to kill innocents, believe it or not. They announce this neighborhood is going to be attacked. They try very hard not to do things, and yet these evil people hide behind innocent people. So what can you do? And Hamas has not been a good government for the people of Gaza either. They have spent all the money on their weapons, their tunnels, and very little on the people. So it's a very nasty situation, and nobody's happy about it. No Jew is happy about what's going on. I'll give you the last word, Reinhardt.
Are there other questions or comments? Yes, ma'am.
Well, let me make one comment. Until the creation, I'm sorry. Up until the creation of Israel in 1948, the anti-Semitism was principally Christian generated. As Father Alexei has talked about, the change, Pope John the 23rd turned the ship around, absolutely turned around, and Pope John Paul II kept it on course. Those two men have done a great deal. But since Israel, as I said, there were 850,000 Jews living in North Africa and the Middle East. Now there are less than 2,000. They are displaced. The whole area, there's just it's hard to say good things.
Yes, I remember this from last time we were together. You're absolutely right. I don't know how Christians throughout our history had to blame Jews for the death of Christ when Christ freely accepts his passion and death for us. And the gesture in your church, or that ritual of each of you coming up and accepting responsibility for putting him on the cross, that's wonderful, absolutely wonderful. I know of other churches that do a similar gesture on that day, but I have to tell you that there are still other Christians who will teach that the Jews are responsible, they are the killers of Christ. I don't know whether I shared last time, but sometimes in my own little parish we have like a vacation Bible school, and we open it up to the people in the neighborhood. A young kid who did not belong to our parish came, and he must have been 5 or 6 years old, and we were sitting around looking at one of the Bible stories, and the term Jew came up. And he put up his little hand and he said, "Now, Father, Jews, they are the ones that killed Jesus, right?" And this was like 5 years ago. So where is this kid getting that? Someone's teaching him that. And this is what we have to be on our guard against. In the Catholic Church, I alluded to the change in the liturgy for Good Friday, and also I usually warn our clergy to be very careful on how they preach during that week, that they don't obfuscate the responsibility for Christ's death, which is all of ours, as you were saying, and not blame someone else for putting him to death.
Are there other questions? Yes, sir. Other comments or questions? Yes, sir.
Well, to me, the progressives have defined this concept of microaggression. You say something I don't like, and I feel threatened, and I feel dangerous, and I'm going to the head of the university to say I don't feel safe. And it's been way overdone in my mind, and people are afraid to deal with it in any way other. And people have been fired for saying trivial things. because the universities, I blame the progressive movement. They developed their own vocabulary. I remember back when Jesse Jackson said that in order to be a racist, you have to have power. So blacks could not be racist to whites, but whites could be racist to blacks. And my vocabulary doesn't work that way, but that has continued on. The concept of power is now the big concept of the left. If you have power, you're bad. If you don't have power, you're good. If you're a corporation, you're bad. If you're an employee, you're good. If you have money, you're bad. If you're poor, you're good, etc. I have problems with that kind of treatment. When I was small, I was partly raised by a lady who was not educated, but she had a very direct sense of right and wrong. If it's right, you do it. If it's wrong, you don't do it. And if you're not sure, you don't do it. We have too much nuance now, and we allow too many people to invent their own vocabulary and why they should. It's not like it used to be, and it's getting worse and worse. People are afraid to say. I'm a big believer in Thomas Sowell. I've read a lot of his books. I don't know if you know him or not, but he says things you just can't argue with. He says, if these people believe so much in diversity, let them put a Republican on the liberal arts faculty. There are just too many definitions that fit a need rather than fit any integrity of words.
Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Well, Reinhard Krauss would say yes, probably, and I would say no. You have that kind of difference. There are people who are extremely I think the Pope said something recently that fighting terror with terror is wrong, and that's very complicated when you go to unwind something like that. It makes a good soundbite, but you know, when you get down to operation and what's going on, how do you do it? And how many war criminals were there in World War II and Korea, and when we didn't have such? You've seen the pictures of all the cities destroyed by bombing in Europe in 1945, totally devastated. I don't have any good answers for that.
Yes, ma'am.
Well, the United Nations had partitioned, first of all, it was partitioned after World War I into Jewish and Muslim areas. And then the United Nations in 1946, I believe, after World War II, partitioned a Jewish area and a Muslim area. Well, before that, it was the Turkish Empire. The Turkish Empire died in World War I. There was no longer an Ottoman Empire at that point. So I don't know, where do you want to go? As I said, there were 850,000 Jews living in North Africa and the Middle East in 1948, and now there are fewer than 2,000. Where do they go? What do they own? There are no good answers. But Israel is the only country in the world who people say they have no right to exist. This is not said about anybody else. a lot after World War I, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, the Brits and the French carved up Africa and the Middle East by crazy geographical lines. They did not take account of tribal, and the tribalism is what dominates those kinds of areas. So we end up with states that have great problems because they have a combination of different kinds of tribes there, and it doesn't work. And they don't work together. They don't like each other. I don't know what you do. But when they drew these lines, there was no Iraq, there was no Syria, there was no Palestine, there was no Lebanon. They were all part of the Turkish Empire and areas under their control.
Yes. Yeah, what can we do? Is there any way to achieve peace in the Middle East? And if there is, what can we do as a population to help bring that about? Is that?
Well, from our point of view, certainly we pray constantly for everyone there, that peace reign there, and that people open themselves to be in. What's peace? Peace is not simply an absence of hostilities, but a right relationship, and that people open themselves there to be in a right relationship with one another. And then as far as what we can do here as well, I think we can mirror that Muslims and Jews and Christians can all live harmoniously together. Again, we don't necessarily always agree with one another, but we can mirror that we can live together. And I think people, they need to see that.
Yes, ma'am. The statement was there will never be peace in the Middle East until the Palestinians love their children more than they hate the Israelis.
There is fanaticism there, and that this is Hamas. There are good people there too. The problem to me in both sides is there is not good leadership. These problems are not going to be solved or even begun to be solved until there is strong and good leadership on both sides. This is what we need.
I would just add, what else can we do? There are groups, one called Abrahamic Reunion, where you can watch. They have some wonderful broadcasts from what we term the Holy Land, where Jews, Muslims, and Christians come together and pray together and learn about each other together, do things together. That's just one such organization. There are several others. In the past, I've been there. I co-teach a course from Loyola Marymount University there, and we visit people where Muslims and Jews and Christians are all together, living, trying to live harmoniously together. And we have to be supportive of all these people.
Any other questions? Comments? One thing that I would like to say before we say thank you to our speakers, one thing that I remind my congregation of frequently is that we are called to love one another. We're not called to like one another. And there is a huge difference. We love one another by respecting one another, by not impeding on one another. Loving somebody doesn't mean that you want to go have dinner with them or go to the movies or anything like that. And I think we confuse the two. Loving somebody means essentially respecting their humanity and their right to exist. It means helping them if they fall down. You don't have to invite them to your birthday party, as my 3-year-old would say. And so I think that we, if we love as we are called to love, I think that is one way that we can help where we are in this world, if we can model that. One other thing that I want to say is that if you do want to arm wrestle Bob over George Washington, I ask that you not arm wrestle there on the table. That is a holy space in the church, and so take your arm wrestling outside.
Anybody. George Washington is number 1.
All right. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Bob and Father Alexi.